Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. A big hello and a big thank you to Blunt C, who left a rating and review of the podcast on Apple Podcasts. They said, really good short podcast episodes each day with relevant content covering subjects you might have heard of, but never had the time to explore properly. A big thank you to you, Blunt C. And remember, anyone that leaves a rating review, send me a screenshot, tell me who you are, and I'll give you a shout out on a future episode. You can do that by just emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. But on with today's show. And I recently read the latest NETSCOUT Threat Intelligence report, which suggested that despite all the headlines we see, the overall number of attacks has decreased last year, but only relative to the pandemic. And there has been an increase in DDoS attacks. And regular listeners will know we've spoken to Darren Anstey on this podcast from NETSCOUT in the past. And that's one of the reasons I always look out for that report. But today I've asked Richard Hummel to join me, and we're going to discuss what the different types of attacks are, how they're used, who the suspected attackers are, which industries have been most targeted, and what business leaders need to be aware of when it comes to DDoS attacks. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the US to speak with Richard about this report and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yes, of course. So Richard Hummel, I am the manager over here for NETSCOUT's ASERT team. And ASERT is essentially our R&D in threat intelligence. So what we do is focus on how the landscape is changing, how adversaries are innovating and adapting to changes in what we as security practitioners are doing or telling our customers to do. And so adversaries have to figure out, how do I get around that? And so that's kind of where my team focuses. And the threat intelligence report that we're going to talk about today is centered around that. What's changed? How are things evolving? What trends are we seeing either now or in the past or even in the future? And really, that's kind of the strategic mandate for what I do here at NETSCOUT.
Fantastic. And we've spoken with Darren Anstey a couple of times on this podcast. I don't know if he's tipped you off, but my first question will be, how did you get here? What's your origin story? And I know it's an audio podcast, but in the background, you've got an Avengers background there. So, so you're more than familiar with the origin story concept. But what would yours be? Where did your passion for tech come from?
You know what? It's a really weird roundabout story. So I joined the military back in 2008. And the intent was I was going to go as a paralegal and go to law school. That was my career path. I had gone to a couple years of pre-law for my undergrad. And that's what I wanted to do. That's where my passion was. And I get to the in-processing center. I've signed my contract. I've done all the testing. I've passed. I literally have my bags packed, ready to go to boot camp. And I sit there for hours and hours and hours. And then they finally come back and say, yeah, you can't be a paralegal. And they couldn't figure out why. So it took them 4 hours to figure out. So I was homeschooled all 12 years, first grade to 12th grade. Yeah. For whatever reason, the Army said, homeschoolers can't be paralegals. No. And so I'm already there. I've got my bags packed. And so I told the recruiter, I was like, you know what? Give me the next hardest thing, the thing that's going to give me the most amount of schooling, the most amount of training there is. And it happened to be signals intelligence. And so that's what I did. I went to boot camp. I went to advanced training. I started doing signals intel. When I get to my unit, I actually didn't go to my unit I was supposed to. Somebody else came right at the last minute and said, no, you're going to be on my unit. And it just kind of like changed everything that my career trajectory, where I was going, what I was going to do. And the new unit says that, you know what, we don't have any cyber analysts. And so you and one other guy are going to go and get on the job training. You're going to learn how to do this cyber thing. And you're going to be the first 2 forward deployed Army soldiers that know how to do cyber. This was before Army had like an actual cyber MOS job. So that's the process. I did that for 4 years. I got out. I did Army contracting, working with various government entities. And then I joined Eyesight Partners in threat intelligence, doing cybercrime, reverse engineering, ransomware. FireEye acquired us. I stayed there for about 4 years, and then I came over here to NETSCOUT. Now I'm doing DDoS. So I've kind of done the whole gamut, right? Nation state tracking, cybercrime tracking, the ransomware piece, now DDoS. But that's my origin story.
Wow, man. And after speaking with nearly 2,000 people on this podcast, I would say your story is a very common one. And the amount of times people say that they were on a certain path, and it's almost like the universe gives you that little nudge in the right direction just when you need it. But of course,
it's crazy how it works. And now it's like, I love this stuff. I live and breathe this stuff. And so like, eventually I still want to go to law school, but I don't imagine myself ever stopping this cybersecurity piece.
Wow, man. And it was that path that led you to NETSCOUT, who do proudly declare to be the guardians of the connected world. But for people that have missed our previous interviews with Darren and hearing about NETSCOUT for the first time, can you just offer a bit of an overview of the type of problems that you're solving for businesses with your tech?
So the main thing that we focus on here is service assurance. We are putting our devices in line to be able to make sure that organizations, enterprises, service providers can always deliver what their product is, right? What if that is internet connectivity, it is transit, capacity for service providers to their consumers. We want to ensure that these DDoS attacks don't disrupt that, don't take it down, don't cause issues, don't cause outages. And the same is true for enterprises, because let's face it, most enterprises today literally live and breathe based on what their public internet presence is. Think of all the e-commerce and all the other organizations that live, breathe, and die by the internet being up. So if that goes down for any period of time, then organizations suffer extreme losses. Think VoIP providers being a hit recently and all that stuff. You think payment card processors going down. What happens with the transactions, right? There's a lot of things here. And so NETSCOUT is very surgically focused on making sure that our customers are always up. Part of my job is to figure out how adversaries are trying to change that, how they're trying to take that always up time down, and what can we do on our products, both from a content perspective as well as from a roadmap perspective, to combat that changing tactics that adversaries are doing. And so from my perspective, that's what we do at NETSCOUT, right? Is we are focused on giving that intelligence, giving that product capability that our customers can have satisfaction and comfort knowing that their internet is going to stay up.
And one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today was to talk about your recent threat intelligence report. But can you tell me a bit more about the report and the background and who you surveyed? Absolutely.
So this is a little bit different. In the past, we've done surveys. You probably have known this as the Worldwide Infrastructure Security Report. And that's what we used to call it. But now, instead of doing a survey, we've realized that, we have all of the data we need. We have customers in the enterprise, customers in the service provider networks. They're giving data back to us, and they're allowing us to see what's happening, what's impacting them, what kind of attacks are out there. And so part of what we want to do with this threat report is we want to give back. We get all this stuff. Awesome. Great. We can see the trends. We can see the anomalies. Now we could be selfish and we could keep that for ourselves. We could put that into our products so customers that pay us can only see that. But no, we want to bring this to the world because DDoS is a global problem. And it's not something that any one service provider is going to solve. It's not something that any one enterprise is going to solve. This is something that every enterprise and every service provider needs to be aware of so that they can protect against it. And so the threat report is really a kind of a public service initiative here where we want to give back to what our customers have shared with us. And we want to give it back in such a way that it shows you that we're doing a deep dive into the entire DDoS threat landscape. Here's what adversaries did. Here's the new vectors they use. Here's what vectors they're preferring and how they're getting around security measures. Here's what's changing in terms of industry and targeting. All of that stuff is things that we want to bring out. And so when we talk about the threat report and what we're publishing there, it's just that. It's security awareness and giving back to the world what has been given to us.
And before you came on the podcast today, I did skim through the report. And one of the things that immediately stood out to me was how it's almost a different narrative to what a lot of us have been seeing on our news feeds, because the overall number of attacks actually decreased last year. So why was that?
So there's a couple of reasons here. But let's not lose focus of what happened in 2021, right? So we ended the year at 9.7 million attacks. Now, 2020 was a record-breaking, crazy phenomena that we'd never seen before. We went over 10 million attacks. So, 9.7 million, when we look at the grand scheme of things, it's not a significant decrease, right? 3% decrease in the number of attacks. If you look at pre-pandemic, it's a 14% increase despite the decreases that we saw toward the end of 2021. So we're nowhere near what we were pre-pandemic. And what happened with the pandemic that kind of changed the face of what we know in the DDoS world is everybody decided to go home. And the vast majority of DDoS attacks are associated with gaming in some fashion or another. This is disgruntled gamers launching attacks. This is gambling associated with different matches, competitions, knocking your opponents offline. What happens when everybody goes home from work or goes home from school? What do? We play games. And I think, you can look at my background here and you can see that I'm probably a big gamer, right? I'm a big nerd. Yeah. And so that's just what we do, right? When we have downtime, I'm playing mobile games on my phone, or I'm loading up my Xbox and I'm playing Call of Duty, whatever it might be, right? And so this is what we do. So what happens when more of that activity occurs? Well, naturally, you're going to get more people that are really mad about the 5-year-old that's sniping them across the map and they want to knock them offline, right? And so now you have this phenomena where just attacks skyrocketed. They exponentially increased. And that's what we saw with COVID. And that continued all the way till when? About August, September timeframe of 2021, which is when the world decided, you know what, we've had it with COVID. We got to go back to normal. We're going to go back to work, in the office. We're going to go to school in person. And so naturally, you have less idle hands. And idle hands, being the devil's workshop, results in more attacks. And so now we see towards the second half of the year why things are decreasing. On top of that, you have this other phenomena, something that we call rebalancing of the scales. So let's go all the way back to previous to 2018. TCP SYN floods, TCP ACK floods, these little bit more process-intensive attack types, right? Because TCPs are connection-oriented attacks, whereas most of the volumetric stuff is connectionless, right? It's just you just flood networks, right? So it used to be TCP SYN floods was the king. It reigned supreme ever since DDoS was a thing all the way up till 2018. Well, then DNS amplification took over. Well, why is that? Well, things like Mirai leveraging different things like that. You also have boot stressor services that started offering DNS amplification as like the thing. And the reason for that is there's tens of millions of DNS servers out there, legitimate DNS servers, that can be abused to amplify traffic. So you don't even have to have a device that's misconfigured. You don't even have to have a device that is compromised. It's just a DNS server is intended to reply to a request and send you data back. And so if you can figure out some way to amplify that traffic for a legitimate server, well, guess what? Now you have a legitimate attack harness that you can leverage. And so DNS amplification reigned supreme up until the first part of 2021. And so in 2021, we saw this increasing decrease, if you will, of DNS amplification and CLDAP. DNS saw a 32% decrease in the second half of the year, and CLDAP 64%. Now, considering that DNS amplification was the reigning supreme for 3 years, you can imagine how many attacks we see with that attack vector, right? So if we go down 32%, that's a significant chunk of that decrease that we saw over the second half. That's like something like 450,000 attacks. And then CLDAP has been in the top 5 for attack vectors. So again, we see a 64% decrease, and there you go. That's made up the number of why we saw decreases combined with kind of going back to the office, going back to school. And now you wrap on 9.7 million because that first part of the year was still record-breaking numbers associated with COVID. And so that's the phenomenon we saw with this decrease. But adversaries moved or preferred these TCP-based floods again. DNS amplification is no longer the king. It's number 3. TCP ACK floods and SYN floods are the number 1 and 2 vectors. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that, again, like I told you, it's a little bit more process intensive. So it might be a little bit harder to mitigate. It can overcome certain levels or layers of defensive measures. But you also have more botnets entering the scene. And botnets typically use these TCP-based attacks, non-spoofed for that matter. In fact, a lot of times when you're looking at these botnet-based attacks, the IP address in question belongs to the host that's actually attacking you. That's not typically true in the DDoS world. There's a lot of spoofing that happens. And so we're seeing this kind of rebalancing here now where this TCP stuff that's always been there is now reigning supreme again, while we're seeing less reflection amplification. And one reason that I think we're seeing less amplification is that more organizations are realizing that, it's actually pretty easy to stop spoof traffic. All I got to say is, if I'm an enterprise, why should an IP address I own ever talk to me from outside the house? Doesn't make any sense, right? So let's just stop that from ever coming in. Service provider, same thing. If they own an IP address And all of a sudden, somebody external to their ASN says, actually, I'm your IP address. I actually belong behind your ASN. That doesn't make any sense, right? So let's just stop that. And so a lot of these companies are getting wise to this and implementing source address validation so that you can no longer spoof the traffic. And so we're going to continue to see this rebalancing, in my opinion.
And what I also found particularly interesting was that colleges, universities and professional schools, they faced a significant increase in DDoS attacks. So I don't know if that was script kiddies just trying to get more time off and spend more time at home gaming. But
you're right on. You honestly are spot
really?
on. In fact, we've actually had a couple of instances. The last 3 threat reports we published, we talked about this phenomena. Every single time we get into the school year, we start to see increases here. Now, the increase we saw this year was fairly significant. It's usually not like nearly 100%. But we actually have worked with our Arbor Cloud team who manages a SOC, and they have worked with law enforcement on at least 2 instances of students, one student not wanting to take a test, so taking down the online testing platform, and another student literally just not wanting to go to school and launching a DDoS attack against the school's platform. Now, law enforcement was able to track both of these individuals down, and obviously they probably got expelled. But that's just it. And then go to, was it 2019? There's a 16-year-old student in Miami-Dade County, Florida, that takes down the entire schooling platform for some 190,000 people. So yeah, these kids, they just don't want to go to school or take it, or maybe they're not prepared, right? And so it is a phenomenon that we see, yeah.
Oh man, that is just amazing. Yep. And of course, the global connectivity supply chain is also increasingly under attack. And I've read also that NETSCOUT observed a large increase in attacks on computer manufacturers and computer storage manufacturing. Can you tell me more about that and why they were particularly targeted?
So I think this is kind of a logical conclusion. So last report, we talked about the connectivity supply chain, as you talked about. That's things like VPNs, internet exchanges, DNS servers. And I mean, these are the things that allow us to communicate on the internet, right? Well, you know what? Attackers realized that didn't really affect us all that much. And in fact, most of these things that we're trying to go after are well protected. Organizations realize that they're targets, and so they put mitigations in place. If that didn't work, what's the next step? Well, let's take it back a little step. Let's go after the actual devices themselves, the companies generating the software that allows you to do these things, the companies that are doing the computer manufacturing. Maybe that'll work. And we see this often when it comes to DDoS attacks. There's a group called Lazarus Bear Armada. We talked about this probably a year and a half, 2 years ago now. LBA first came out, and they came out with a bang. They took down the New Zealand Stock Exchange, and they bragged about it. And for 4 days, the stock exchange was offline, causing probably uncountable amounts of damage and revenue loss, stock traders, whatever it might be, right? So they bragged about this. But what did they do? So they started with a logical progression of their attacks. They went after the financial industry. They went after commercial banks. They went after stock exchanges. They went after things that are adjacent, like money exchange sites, Travelex. They went after things like insurance providers and brokerages. And then what they did is they said, you know what, let's go where the money is, or where we perceive the money to be, and see if we can get a payday. And what they realized quickly is that people don't really pay DDoS extortion demands. They just don't, because you can recover from those. There's an end in sight. You can implement prevention. There's a lot of things you can do that's maybe separate from ransomware. And so they just walked the stack, and they kept going and going until they got into logistics providers. They got into manufacturing industries. They went to energy. I mean, they just kept going, and it was just this logical progression. So I feel like the same thing is happening in the connectivity supply chain and digital supply chain, is adversaries trying to find some area that's a weak link for them to be able to get a payday. Now, what's interesting though is software publishers are not just being hit by DDoS. I've read a number of reports over the past few weeks that talks about intrusion events being up when it comes to software publishers. And so they're under attack from more places than just DDoS. And it's just an area that, for whatever reason, the cyber criminal world has decided, let's go after the software publishers. And maybe there's a motivation behind that. Maybe they're trying to actually compromise some of the software as it's distributed so that they can then propagate even further. Maybe they have a grudge to pick with certain software. The motivations range very far for these kinds of attacks. From I just want to see the world burn, to I have a grudge to pick, to I'm going to demonstrate So it's really tough to say this is why it's being targeted, but it is a phenomenon that we're seeing.
And I suspect because we're living in uncertain times, before today's podcast, a lot of people out there would have assumed that attackers are state-sponsored and from different regions, attacking governments, etc. But we've already talked about kids doing it just to not go to school. So it seems to be incredibly varied, and so does the attack method. So what are the different types of attack, and who are the suspected attackers? Is it just right across the board and there isn't just one profile?
It's across the board. So here, let me paint this kind of frightening picture for you. I got a question from a journalist that asked me, hey, what is the average cost you're seeing to launch a DDoS attack? And immediately my response was, 20 USD. And that's based on knowledge that I had from 2018. Wow. And so I started looking. I was like, has that changed? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? What are the methods by which somebody can launch a DDoS attack? And little did I know that nobody talks about this. In fact, the last comprehensive report that I had read was back in 2018, where I got that $20 in my mind. And so I broke out my malware analysis machine from my reverse engineering days. And I said, you know what? I'm going to spin up a VPN. I'm going to spin up a Tor browser, and I'm just going to go poke around the dark web. And so as I started to do that, I looked at these booter stressor platforms, and I was a bit staggered because there's hundreds of these things. I found a list of like 400 different booter stressor services. And so what I did is I sorted those by which ones are most active use, which ones look more professional, and I chose 19 of them. I started logging into these 19, creating fake accounts, taking screenshots. And what I found was a bit concerning, because now there is literally zero barrier to entry to launching a DDoS attack. None whatsoever. Every single one of these 19 services has a free tier that they offer. You can launch anywhere between 3 to 5 different types of attacks, things like DNS amplification, CLDAP, NTP, some TCP-based attacks for free. All you need is a single IP address to target, and you push a button. So you don't even need to have a crypto wallet. You don't have to put in a validated email address. You can create a fake one like I did. And so there's literally no reason why anyone couldn't launch a DDoS attack these days, which is a scary proposition. And as you start to look at these attack vectors and types, I mean, there's any number of different attack types. In fact, there's very specific attacks to overcome like CAPTCHA pages, or pages that require a certain amount of time on screen before you do something else. There's attack types that go after online games like Call of Duty and Warhammer and various other things like this. And so very, very specific targets, but also very broad things that says, you know what? Here's an attack that's against HTTP, whatever. Could be any application running on HTTP, which just the intent is to overwhelm a web server. And so these different platforms offer different tiers of service. They also offer customization. So you can say, you know what? 6,500 USD, I can launch 100 attacks at once that can get a guaranteed 1 terabit per second of attack traffic, and I can run it for a week at a time. Now, you could pay that if you want to, but the reality is you don't need to launch really big attacks to take down your target. You just have to be surgical, and you have to know your target. And so if maybe you're a gamer and you're VoIP chatting with somebody else and you have their IP address, well, maybe you launch a really small attack that a service provider doesn't necessarily care about, but is just enough to cause some lag for your opponent. Guess what? You've won the match. And so, you can use this free tier of service to effectuate actual issues for your target. Now, you can scale it up if you want. Some of these things say 2,500 USD, and now you can launch a guaranteed 1 million packets per second using 150,000 different bots around the world. Now, I've never seen a 1 terabit per second attack launch from one of these things. They boast about it, they talk about it, but to date, we don't usually see that. In fact, the LBA guys I talked about previously, I think the upper bands that we saw from them was probably around 300 or 400 gigabits per second, but the vast majority was right around 150 gigabits per second. And we believe they were using these booter stressor services to actually launch their attacks. And so there's a typically kind of an average space. And most of the attacks from these things are very short-lived, like less than 5 minutes. And that just speaks to these free tiers that people are launching. They're not paying for duration. They're just doing a quick test, right? And so there's all kinds of things you can do. You can, in fact, go in there and work on some sliders. And you can say, I want 7 attacks. I want it to last 15 seconds. I want to use these vectors, and I want to launch it against these targets. And then it'll just pop out a cost. It'll say you owe 123 USD. Click here to pay with PayPal, Bitcoin, wire transfer, Western Union. I mean, these guys function just like a business, right? You don't even need a crypto wallet. It's the craziest thing. And so, yeah, it's a little bit scary proposition. So to answer your question is literally anybody can launch these attacks, and every single kind of person with any number of motivations actually do launch these attacks.
And we've talked about everything from a school to the entire supply chain being targeted here. And I'm curious, we've probably just frightened the life out of a lot of business leaders listening, talking like this. So what should they be aware of when it comes to DDoS attacks?
So a little silver lining here is that all of the stuff that I just talked about, the boot stressor service, the attacks launched from them, these are known entities for the most part. And so it's very rare that you get a really sophisticated group like LBA launching attacks against you. Most of the time it's these, people don't know exactly how the attack works. They just know that you can do it. You're going to input an IP address. The attacks themselves are not novel. They're not using new vectors, new techniques. And so the reality is that as long as you understand what's out there, it's very easy to prepare and mitigate these kinds of attacks. And so the first step is making sure that you realize you will be the target of a DDoS attack at some point in time, whether directly or indirectly. And I say indirectly because DDoS is like taking a rock and throwing it into the water. And yeah, you're going to hit the spot you threw it at, but all of those concentric rings is the impact. And so DDoS always has a ripple effect, and it's always going to affect everything around it. So whether you realize it or not, you have probably experienced the DDoS attack because it has slowed up your home network, or maybe kicked you offline for a period of time, or transit links were saturated, and so loading a web page took a long time. I guarantee all of us have experienced this at some point in time if you use the internet. And if you're watching this, then obviously you do. And so everybody's going to be impacted at some point in time. So realizing that, understanding the attack methods, the vectors, by consuming things like our threat intelligence report will help you a long way down the road to be able to prevent these things. And then taking the next step, which is, okay, I'm an enterprise, I'm a service provider, maybe I'm a small enterprise. There's solutions for you. There's cloud, right? Maybe I'm an enterprise that doesn't have a security team. There's a managed service. Maybe I'm a really big enterprise, or I'm a service provider. There's scrubbing centers you can stand up, right? There's any number of kind of right-size solutions. Making sure that you have something in place is going to take you about 80 or 90% of the way. It's another 10 to 20% that is constantly evolving, adapting, changing, where you need to pay attention to podcasts like this. You need to read threat reports to figure out, okay, this is what adversaries did. This is how I got to change my security posture. And so, yeah, DDoS is absolutely preventable. So taking these best current practices, making sure that you're aware of it is going to get you there.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the podcast and bringing this subject to life for us today. I do hope people check out that report. But before we leave the details for that, I always like to ask my guests to leave the listeners with a personal touch of inspiration, as well as scaring them about DDoS attacks as well. But is there a book or song or anything that has inspired or accompanied you on your career that you can leave everyone listening with today? And is there a story behind that choice?
I think that the biggest thing that I would say is find your passion.
Yeah.
I didn't know cybersecurity was my passion until I got into it. And so part of that is you have to be willing to try new things. You have to be willing to learn new things. And especially in this kind of career field, and really kind of any career field that you can think of, learning ignites a passion. And as you learn more, you realize what you're good at, where you excel at, and then doubling down on that. So as I look at what I want to do with my career, yes, I love law. Eventually, I want to do that again, but I can never imagine not doing cybersecurity. So now if I ever go to law school, I'm going to be doing cybersecurity law, because I've realized that this is where I like to be. This is an ever evolving, ever changing thing. It requires me to learn something new every single day. And that learning is what keeps me interested in waking up every day, coming to work every day. And now it's not a chore to come to work. It's, oh, what has changed in the DDoS landscape today? What has changed in the cyber threat landscape today? And so making sure that you have that passion to learn, I think is going to help you in everything that you do, whether it's your daily life, taking care of your kids, learning how to raise your kids better, or working in a professional environment. And so to me, it's all about the learning, constantly ingesting new things, filling up my mind with new ideas. And that's, to me, has been the biggest motivation for myself.
Fantastic advice. And I echo the sentiments of everything you just said there. And for everyone listening that wants to find out more information about anything we talked about today, such as check out that report that we've referenced quite a lot in today's conversation, or just check out your website and contact your team, what's the best starting point?
So netscout.com/threat report will get you there. It's a fully interactive report. So I definitely encourage you guys to take a look at that. We also have a Twitter handle where we'll post updates periodically. ASERT Research is the handle. And then we also have an ASERT blog where we're posting new things constantly about the DDoS threat landscape, how things are changing. So lots of ways to be able to stay in the loop, plugged in, and understand how adversaries are changing.
Well, so much I loved about today's conversation, and we're recording this on a Friday. I know I'm going to be thinking over the weekend about DDoS-for-hire services and how more accessible to the public and not even require a nominal fee or a crypto wallet or anything. You know, it's quite scary, but also for leaving with us a bit of inspiration and sharing your very personal story. There's so many lessons to be learned in your story too. And thank you so much for taking the time to share it with me today.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The fact that DDoS-for-hire services are now more accessible to the public than ever before, and you don't even have to pay a fee, is more than a little concerning, isn't it? But what did you take away from the report and indeed today's conversation? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Any questions, different viewpoints, or pictures to come on the podcast, whatever it might be, email me now. You should know this off by heart by now. techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. Keep those messages coming in. And if you've got nothing to say about today's episode, have no fear. I've got another one lined up for you tomorrow, and I hope you'll join me for that one. So thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.